whatever it is.
Let me get into that. Let's see.
Are you sitting outside on your deck? I think you're muted.
Yeah, Paul's muted.
There we go. Yes, I'm out on our screen porch. Indeed.
Great. Looks like a nice setting.
Anyway,
If the cicadas bother you too much, I'll mute back up.
For the cicadas are really been active this year.
Indeed.
We have
Why do
put
you
on a
think?
show.
Because of all the rain?
It's a 17-year anniversary for the cicadas.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, this is the year.
Well, it's 12 o'clock, so let's call the meeting to order, if you will, please. And Coy, since you're on, you're going to give our invocation this morning, and you have the floor.
Thank you, President Lou. And if you would, everyone, let's pause for a moment, and we'll have our invocation. Oh God, the creator of all things, we thank you for this glorious day. Guide us as we strive to do your will. Thank you for the opportunity to serve others in order to make our community, our state, and our nation a better place to live and work. During these unprecedented times, we pray for those who have been victims of the COVID-19 and the millions who have lost their jobs. May your healing and peace be with them that only you can give. And thank you for the members of this club who are committed to Rotary's motto of service above self. These things we pray in your holy name. Amen.
amen.
Thank you, Coy. Appreciate that. And
Yes, indeed.
David, can you bring the flag up for us, please, sir? Thank you. So now let's recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag,
United
States of America,
and to the
and to
republic
the republic
which
for
stands
which it stands,
One
one
nation,
one
nation,
nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
for all. Thank you, David. And before we get into our program, I want to take just a minute to give a special thank you to David Leonetti for his work on the wine tasting we did last Friday. I thought it turned out to be a resounding success. Everybody enjoyed it. We learned a lot about how wines are grown and how the vineyards operate. We had a pretty good turnout, and I'm sorry for anyone who didn't join us on it. And I hope that sometime in the future we can do it again, because it really was a delightful way to spend the evening and socialize a little bit, even if it was virtual instead of in person. So David, our thank you for that. It was a great job, and you're to be commended for that.
Well, you're quite welcome. I enjoyed doing it. I had a good time. Thanks.
Well, good. Thank you for that. And now our program this morning is by David Hood, and the title is North Carolina History and Public Monuments. So David, you have the floor.
All right. Well, I'm mainly just going to introduce my brother John, who's going to give the program. So many of you will know John. He's actually appeared at our club on several occasions back years ago as the program, and he's probably primarily known in Hickory because his column is in the paper on most Sundays in the Hickory Daily Record.
Right.
So the idea here it basically is a riff off of some columns that John's been doing lately about. In the midst of controversy about monuments to history, let's talk about people who don't have enough recognition from history. So that's the primary topic today, and I'm going to let John take it away.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for putting up with me. That's not necessarily a prediction of future trouble this hour, but it's possible. The truth is that I have been on a lifelong quest to build a reputation, maintain a certain level of competence, decorum, and I am repeatedly thwarted in my efforts by the antics of somebody who looks and sounds very much like me. And all are all subject to this particular individual. And so I start out, I know, sort of behind the eight ball, but I'm hoping that I can earn your trust and respect. This subject is important. Obviously, it's been a touchstone in North Carolina for a number of years. We've seen protests in a number of North Carolina cities. You may remember several years ago when a group of protesters tore down the Silent Sam statue at UNC Chapel Hill, which had been controversial for many years and debated really for decades. More recently, we had protests in the state capitol and in Durham, both of which resulted in statues being torn down or defaced or attacked in some fashion. And in response to what happened in Raleigh, a couple of months ago, the governor actually ordered the really tall Confederate memorial and some other things on the state capitol grounds to be removed, arguably to save them or to reduce the chances for violence and unrest in the city as the protests continued. Arguably, it was an illegal act to take the statue down. I don't want to litigate any of that, but just to remind you of the predicate of this conversation, which is that Confederate memorials and statues in particular, but actually, as we've seen around the country, a range of memorials and monuments and statues have become controversial of late, sometimes not of late. And the debate is usually about, should we leave statues up? Should we tear them down? Or should we move them somewhere usually less visible? And what I've been writing about and thinking about recently, as David pointed out, is why are those the only options we're talking about so much? In my view, this issue of monuments and statues it's an important one. It's not an easy one, and it's also not a simple one. So if we could distinguish between easy, which is not hard to do or not hard to think through, and simple, which is the opposite of complex, I think that the statue issue is neither easy nor simple. I like to quote C.S. Lewis in this context. He said that besides being complicated, reality in my experience is usually odd. It is not neat, it's not obvious, it's not what you would expect. I think that's true of many things, and I think it's true about this issue of monuments or even Confederate monuments in particular. One way that we know it's really not very simple is that North Carolinians, to the extent that we have been asked our opinions, I mean, separate from politicians who do things or a small percentage of us who are protesters who might go out and do things about statues, the vast majority of North Carolinians, when asked, which has not been often enough, what do you actually think about statues and monuments, including those involving the Confederacy? What should we do about them? When you look at the polling on this, it shows that our opinions are not simple. We have mixed opinions. We have complex opinions. And I think that's shouldn't be surprising and is in fact indeed appropriate for the issue. I'll call your attention to a poll that I looked at from the Elon University polling unit. They poll North Carolinians on a regular basis about a lot of things. And one of the things I like about the Elon folks is that they don't just ask a simple yes or no question and move on. They really try to dig deep into a weighty topic and figure out what North Carolinians really think about it. So back in November of last year, they asked North Carolinians about the Confederate statue issue. And the simplest question was, do you think Confederate monuments should stay in public spaces or not? And actually, that was not a particularly closely divided answer. About 65% of North Carolinians said that Confederate monuments should stay in public spaces, and 35% said they should be removed. Now, if you're inclined to like leaving things the way they are, that's the answer you grab onto. Well, 65, almost 2/3 of North Carolinians think do nothing. But that's not exactly what the poll found. So if you look more deeply into what people think about statues, if asked, do you think it would be a good idea if we've got a statue on a public square of a Confederate soldier or whatever, Confederate monument of some kind, do you think there should be plaques or other material placed around the statue so that people can understand it in context? And 72% of North Carolinians said, yes, we should do that. And what about taking that statue out of the public square in front of the courthouse, for example, and moving it to a museum or a battlefield? 65% of North Carolinians said that sounds like a good idea. What about replacing the Confederate memorial, Confederate statue, with something that honors North Carolinians who fought against slavery? Well, that was a more mixed answer. 37% of North Carolinians said they liked that. 35% said they didn't like that. 28% weren't sure. So you can already see that, well, of course, there are North Carolinians who take all sorts of positions. So 25% of North Carolinians is still a lot of people. But one might say that most North Carolinians neither want to take all the statues down and hide them or move them far away, or leave them exactly the way they are. There are people who are in the middle, who are willing to leave things but contextualize them, or maybe move them from one place where they're really prominent. Say at Chapel Hill, the Silent Sam statue is right close to Franklin Street. There were probably quite a few North Carolinians who would have been comfortable leaving Silent Sam on the UNC campus, but moving it somewhere else, moving it to the center of campus, moving it to South Campus, moving it to some other place that surrounded by other statues or other monuments. So these issues are more complicated than simply trying to boil them down into a yes or no answer. Also, people are quite familiar, I have found, and the polling shows, with the sort of conflicting views about these kinds of things, including people having conflicting views themselves. So for example, in that Elon poll, 3/4 of North Carolinians said that Confederate statues honor Confederate soldiers who passed away. And about the same percentage, about 3/4, said that they help people know a little bit more about the history of the country. However, 49% of the same people, same group of North Carolinians surveyed, said that they glorify slavery and the Confederacy, what the Confederacy fought for, which in their minds is slavery. So you could think all of these things at the same time, which I also find interesting. And when you ask people, for example, about the Confederate flag, what do you think what reaction do you personally have to the Confederate flag? This may surprise you, but 20% of North Carolinians said they had a positive reaction to the Confederate flag, and 36% have a negative reaction, and 44% don't really care about it. And that should tell us also a little something about, while people take these issues seriously, it's not usually at the top of their agenda, and their mixed views lead them to not really be all that doctrinaire back one direction or the other. And I'll leave you with one final poll result from the same poll that should make us all sober about this entire issue, which is that 54% of these same North Carolinians surveyed thought that Ulysses S. Grant was a Confederate general. Now, all of that having been said, people's views about this issue are colored by their own backgrounds, whether they've been in North Carolina a long time. There were differences according to whether you were a native or not. And large numbers of us actually lack basic information about the historical subjects in question, which I think should urge us all to be humble and trying to think through exactly what would be the most constructive way to approach this kind of issue. Just as the public opinion on this issue is complex and interesting and perhaps frustrating, the history of the Confederate monuments and when they were put up is not actually easily reducible to a single story. There was a wave of monuments that happened right around the beginning of the 1900s. Part of that was certainly, and there were plenty of documented cases where these statues were put up in order to honor the lost cause of the Confederacy in the context of the, at that time, segregation and fights against Black empowerment and Black enfranchisement in North Carolina. So some of it really was the statues being used as a sort of a weapon in a current culture war. On the other hand, there's also evidence that some of the statues were placed simply because The Confederate veterans were passing away. It was about to be the 50th anniversary of the start of the Civil War. And so some of it was truly just commemorating fathers and uncles and grandfathers and so forth who were passing away. We know that that's also the story because there were Union statues being placed in northern states around the same time. Obviously, that wasn't designed simply to advance Jim Crow segregation or something. It was because the clock was ticking and the calendar led these mostly female-led organizations, historical memory organizations, to set up memorials for people, for their fathers, their husbands, their grandfathers, their uncles who were passing away. So with that complexity underlined in the story, what I want to talk a little bit about is what I think would be a more constructive way for those of us in North Carolina who care about this issue to try to advance things without this constant turmoil and struggle. I'm not against having spirited conversations about policy issues. That's what I do for a living. As David said, I've actually been writing a syndicated column on North Carolina politics and public policy since 1986. It's been a while. And my column is run in the Hickory Daily Record and about 50 other newspapers for many years. I debate issues all the time. I get into arguments. People call me names. Some of them are deserved. So I'm not reflexively against contentious debate and differences of opinion. But what I strongly disagree with is the notion that we should allow our differences of opinion on current issues, or in this case on historical memory, to devolve into shouting matches and screaming matches and acts of vandalism and criminal mischief and violating the law and people brandishing guns and leading to violence. I mean, surely we had, in our country, in our state, we can grapple with these challenging, complex issues in a more constructive way. And I personally think that a much more constructive way to do this will be to talk about what statues and monuments we're going to put up, rather than simply what statues and monuments and memorials we're going to tear down or move. I don't know about you, but I've been to many cities in North Carolina. I live in the state, near the state capital of Raleigh, so I'm very familiar with the statuary and the monuments and the public buildings that exist in our state capital, but I've also been to all the other major cities in the state and lots of the smaller towns. I've been to almost all, but I actually can't say all 100 counties. I think I've been to 98 counties. I've been to courthouses. I've been to public squares. I've looked at lots of statues and monuments. And my position is that we are underpopulated with public art. If you go to other states, if you go to Washington, D.C., where I used to live, there's a statue at every corner almost. There are lots of monuments to lots of interesting and important people and events and trends and institutions. And I think North Carolina really hasn't invested enough of its time and effort in memorializing our history. We have these historical markers along the roads. I like them. Perhaps you like them. I certainly enjoy them. When I'm driving somewhere unfamiliar and I see one of those historical markers next to the road, if I have time, I will pull off to the side of the road so I can look at it more carefully and try to figure out what they're talking, what person or event that it's commemorating, and maybe I'll do some research later. I like that, but that's just the bare minimum of the kind of thing that I would like us to be doing in North Carolina. We also have a number of historic sites, but in my view, not enough of them, and they're not very well maintained anymore. And even the historic sites that we have, a lot of them are kind of sparse. They don't really have a lot in them, that we don't have a lot of monuments and statues and other public art, reliefs and mosaics and frescoes and other kinds of public art that help to tell North Carolina's story. I think this is an absence that we should fill, and I think we can fill it in a way that is unifying, that can bring North Carolinians together to learn about and celebrate our shared history rather than just fight about it all the time. Now, whatever person or group or trend or historical event we choose, there might be some disagreement about it, but a lot of times what people will accept is, even if I'm not 100% behind this particular president, governor, legislator, artist, business leader, maybe I don't agree with everything that person did, but if we're honoring lots of people, not just a few, not just allocating scarce resources to just a few, then I'm willing to honor people even if they weren't sort of on my team or someone who I look upon as a touchstone, but someone who's important in our history. What I decided to do in my column actually was start out with people who it's probably very unlikely anybody wouldn't honor, wouldn't be willing to commemorate if they just knew about them. I decided to begin with figures that I thought had played a very important role in history and haven't been neglected. Sometimes there have been whole books written about them, but there's not really very much public art or monuments or statues. People don't immediately recognize their names in North Carolina, and I think we should change that. Let me give you some examples of the kinds of historical figures I'm talking about, just to give you a range. I've written several columns now in the series. I've got several more coming out. And the first one I'll mention is actually named Hood, but he is not related to John or David Hood. His name is James Walker Hood. And he was actually born a free black, so he's not a slave who became emancipated. He was born into a family of free African Americans in Pennsylvania. His father, Levi Hood, was a minister, so James Walker Hood followed in his father's footsteps. He studied to become a minister, and eventually he became a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. During the Civil War, James Walker Hood, I think bravely, went to North Carolina. He was from Pennsylvania. He of course was in the Union. He was free. And he journeyed to North Carolina in 1863 once the Union had established a beachhead in New Bern on the coast. Hood and actually a number of other free black and emancipated black Americans went into North Carolina and other southern states in part to help freed slaves or to help free slaves, and also to provide infrastructure or even recruit these freed slaves into the Union Army. So Reverend Hood was one of those people. He went to New Bern. He spent some time there. It was not a safe place necessarily to be, even though the Union troops occupied the city. There were lots of Confederate partisans. There were blacks, both free and recently emancipated blacks, who were attacked by partisans during this period. So it was a brave thing to come to North Carolina. And then after the war, Hood stayed in North Carolina and helped to build, first of all, the AME Zion Church in North Carolina, but also the Republican Party in North Carolina, and the whole idea of organizing Black North Carolinians politically. This is something that James Walker Hood was a big leader of. In fact, he helped to call and served as the first president. This was right after the Civil War in 1865. He presided over the first convention, political convention of Black North Carolinians that was ever held. Later, he became a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1868. This was when Reconstruction was underway, and there were lots of people wanting to rewrite the Constitution. Reverend Hood wanted to make sure that Black North Carolinians were represented. He and others were part of that Constitutional Convention. And in fact, Hood was so influential in debating different provisions of the proposed Constitution that the reactionaries who didn't like the Constitution started calling it Hood's Constitution, trying to make it, trying to weaken its credibility by associating it with a Black leader. Didn't work. The Constitution was enacted in 1868. It had a lot of important provisions in it. One of them was to provide public education for the first time to all young North Carolinians, regardless of race. And actually, Reverend Hood became the first significant Black official in state government because he became the deputy superintendent of public instruction, and his job was to essentially supervise the construction of schools for freed Blacks. So it was very important in the constitutional founding of our state, and during Reconstruction, founding of public education in North Carolina, several other causes, and he was important in creating a two-party system because he was helping to head the Republican Party as it began to develop. Another person that I think deserves a statue in Raleigh and elsewhere is someone who was sometimes an ally of Hood and sometimes an adversary of Reverend Hood, and his name was Abraham Galloway, really one of the most fascinating North Carolinians you will ever hear about. And there is a book about Abraham Galloway called The Fire of Freedom that I highly recommend you read. Now, unlike Hood, he was a native North Carolinian. He was born into slavery. He was a slave. He was born in what is now Southport. He worked as a slave in Wilmington for many years. Wilmington had, as you might expect, a very large nautical industry and construction industry. He worked in that industry as a mason and a construction worker. And in 1857, he escaped Wilmington by hiding. He and a friend hid in the cargo hold of a schooner that was headed for Philadelphia. This was not an easy thing to do. The authorities in Wilmington knew that slaves were trying to smuggle themselves out on ships, and they would do things like pipe smoke into the cargo hold and choke anybody who might be hiding there. And that's what they actually tried to do to Abraham Galloway, but he put a bandana over his face and sort of toughed his way through it. They tried poison, they tried acid, all kinds of things to go after people trying to escape slavery. Well, he did. He got to Philadelphia, eventually got to Canada, worked as an abolitionist in Canada and also in Haiti. And here's another brave person. Civil War breaks out, and Abraham Galloway volunteers to go back south. Now, he's an escaped slave, so he is subject to being captured and enslaved or even killed for escaping. But instead, he goes back to the South. He leaves the safe territory and becomes a spy for the Union Army, spying across the countryside, helping also to lead slaves to freedom in Dewburn. Later, he acts as a Union recruiter for the Army. But when the Union officials try to recruit blacks to join the Union Army, Abraham Galloway says, "We're not going to do it unless you agree to pay us equitably and treat us equitably, and unless you pledge that you're fighting to abolish slavery, not just to reestablish the Union." So he was an important political leader even during this period when he was still in his late 20s. After the war, he also was involved in creating the Republican Party in North Carolina. He was also a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1868. And a few months later, he was elected to the General Assembly as a state senator. And interestingly, in 1868, Abraham Galloway became the first Black North Carolinian to ever be on a statewide ballot and win. Now, he wasn't running for governor. We didn't actually elect governors statewide at that time. But what he did is he was an elector for the presidential ticket in 1868. So his name was listed on the ballot. He got the majority of the votes. And so he has that notoriety. He was an important member of the General Assembly in the brief time he was there, fought for a lot of causes. If you're a progressive North Carolinian, if you lean to the left, you're going to like some of what Abraham Galloway fought for. For example, trying to give more opportunity for labor unions to organize in North Carolina. Now, if you're more of a right-leaning North Carolinian like I am, you appreciate Abraham Galloway championing the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, including for blacks to bear arms, and his skepticism about government-subsidized railroads and other corporations. Interesting man. He died very young of natural causes, though he was constantly at threat of being assassinated, and there were several attempts on his life, but he died in his early 30s. There's no statue of Abraham Galloway. There's no statue of James Walker Hood. There's some little markers. You can read about them. But these are not people that we know well, and they are fascinating and important figures in the history of North Carolina. I'll give you one more example. I look forward to taking your questions in a few minutes, but I'll give you one more example of someone who I think genuinely deserves a whole lot more attention than this person has gotten, and her name is Annie Alexander. She grew up in Charlotte. She was the daughter of a famous doctor, an important family in Charlotte, the Alexander and Brevard families in Charlotte. She decided to go into medicine, and she actually became the first licensed physician in the American South to be a woman. They told her she couldn't do it. She refused to listen to them. She went off to medical school in Maryland. She took the licensing exam in Maryland. There were 100 people taking the test. She got the top score, 99 men, and Annie Alexander. She eventually ended up back in Charlotte, created the first physician practice led by a woman in Charlotte. She was important in the medical profession in Charlotte for a long time, not just in gynecology and obstetrics, but in other fields such as infectious disease. During the Spanish flu epidemic, she was important in the medical treatment. She actually, during the war, got an appointment into the military. She became Lieutenant Annie Alexander, and she helped supervise the medical treatment of recruits at camp in Charlotte. She's someone else. I mean, she has an historical marker, but why not a statue? Why not a monument? Why not something honoring her as a symbol of opening up opportunities for people of all backgrounds, sexes, races to contribute to and participate in North Carolina's rich traditions and society. I'll mention one more thing that actually is underway that I'm very happy about, one that I was involved in supporting. There is now a plan to build a new monument on the North Carolina State Capitol grounds, honoring African-American North Carolinians. And a couple of blocks away, there is a project that I've been supporting and involved in for several years called North Carolina Freedom Park, which will be a sculpture park. So it won't depict any particular individuals, but it will celebrate the March of Freedom, including the March of Freedom for African Americans in North Carolina, through other kinds of public art. So both of those projects have now been funded by private and public sources. They're going to be proceeding. I think that the monument on the state capitol grounds will probably have individual leaders depicted. I hope they are, because I think that'll be a nice complement to the other statues that are already on the Capitol grounds, statues of former presidents, statues of other people. So there is movement in this direction, but I think not nearly enough. And the focus so much being, what do we take down? What do we try to not see anymore? I think is profoundly mistaken. We want to see public art in its original context to some extent, because that itself is history. Someone puts up a mosaic, puts up a statue, puts up a monument in 1893 or 1963. Not only is the content of the monument itself important, but the fact that it was done in that time is itself historically important. So I think we should be very careful not to just move things around, tear them down. Though I also believe, maybe you disagree with me, I also believe that no current generation can determine forever what is going to be erected and stay on a particular piece of property. So if 2 or 3 generations later, there's a statue right in front of the city hall, and the current residents of that city think, well, that doesn't really reflect our values, I think they should have the right to put something in that space right in front of City Hall that they think better reflects the values of their community. And whatever was there, I mean, just don't move it far away. Just sort of keep it in context, but don't tear it down. I think that's a constructive approach that can bring North Carolinians together around our shared history, as opposed to constantly tearing us apart. Again, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have robust debates about Medicaid and national security and COVID-19 and tax policy. These are the kinds of things that I welcome and do myself. But shouldn't we spend some time celebrating what we have in common and finding ways, finding tales that we can tell about our state, whether you're from here or you've adopted this state as your home? Shouldn't we find ways to tell our story that are uplifting and bring people together rather than driving us apart? So with that, David, I take it we could answer questions or take comments, or how should we proceed from this point?
Yes, I mean, people can put questions into the chat. If they want to type a question into the chat function, we can see it there. Or if you want to unmute yourself and sort of break into a question, that'd be okay too. If you want to tell John he's full of, you know what, that's fine. I'm hoping someone will take that opportunity.
You don't want to have to do it yourself.
I've been doing it so long, I want someone else to do it.
Okay.
If you don't have any questions, that's okay too.
Well, hey, John, this is Dave Ludwig. I really like your last comment to do with months, everything else should bring us pretty contentious and divisive. I like the idea of focusing on who we all could and focus types of things that will root as historic memorabilia. So thanks for that.
Well, I appreciate that. And like I said, I do think it would be unrealistic to expect that everything and everybody that we might honor with a future monument is going to be universally popular. I mean, we've still got, I hope that you agree, maybe you don't, but we have a statue of George Washington on the North Carolina State Capitol grounds. I think it should remain. I think George Washington deserves his acclaim as one of the key founders of our nation, and frankly, of liberal democracy in the world. He's a world figure, and yet, of course, he had flaws. We all know he was a slave owner. His views about slavery were complicated and evolved over the course of his life. I'm fairly well persuaded by the end of his life that he wasn't just grudgingly in favor of abolition. He was absolutely in favor of abolition. But he also recognized the legal constraints that a planter in Virginia at his time was under. He freed the slaves that he owned, but he could not free the slaves under the Virginia law that his wife owned. It was a complicated set of challenges. Also, there were a number of other founders who I think we should celebrate. Thomas Jefferson is one, who again had a mixed and evolving and sometimes problematic view about slavery and racial equality. But we should remember that at his time, I mean, the man was constantly in debt, and he actually was not legally allowed to free his slaves. If he had attempted to free his slaves, then all of his creditors would have said, no, you can't. And those property, the slaves, including the other property, included in the other property, would have been confiscated and given to his creditors. So these are stories that are complicated, and people could have different views about them. But we can surely view somebody like a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson or an Abraham Lincoln, who had some complex views of his own and behavior. We can surely see them as people who advanced something like most of us believe to be progress from at their time, with the opportunities and the knowledge and the constraints that they were under, that they advanced things in the right direction. We should be able to celebrate those people. And there are others that we could add. I mean, there are people from the civil rights movement that, whether it's in North Carolina or other states, that we certainly should be memorializing, erecting statues of, and who had flaws. Obviously, Martin Luther King being one of them. We're simply not going to find human beings who did important things, including things we would want to celebrate, who didn't also make mistakes, have significant failings, have significant oversights. That's just part of the human experience, and it's part of what you learn. So when school kids go to Monticello or see a statue of George Washington or go to Mount Vernon, and I think this is excellent. I have a friend who actually depicts Thomas Jefferson and Monticello. That's his job. He's an actor. He used to be at Williamsburg. Now his job, he works for Monticello depicting Thomas Jefferson. And what he and the folks who run that place do now is they contextualize it. They talk about the slaves. They talk about the slave quarters. And so you can learn all of that at the same time. And we can do that for monuments that I think bring us together without requiring that we be completely unanimous about the individuals being honored.
So we've got some chat questions here. I get the first and the third ones on the chat might be ones you can answer at the same time. What organizations or groups decide which monuments are done? What are the guidelines? Do the state and the state house or senate have particular plans, and how does that work? So just sort of generally give us an idea there.
Whether we're talking about state or university or local property is important, because obviously these all have their own different governing boards and authorities. The two projects that I mentioned, the African-American monument that's going to go on the Capitol grounds and North Carolina Freedom Park that's going to be sort of near the legislative building. These started out as initiatives that were privately driven, that were commissions or nonprofits, in the case of the Freedom Park, that had a board and they raised private money. But they also went to the legislature. Actually, the legislature funded both projects this year. They tried to fund them last year, but it got tied up in the fights between the legislature and the governor over the budget. This year, I believe that the funding for the monuments was put into something the governor chose not to veto. And so it's actually now been funded with public and private dollars together. But those are the state projects. There is a historical commission that governs state projects on state property like that. Local governments can initiate the construction and placement of monuments on local property. What they're constrained to do by state law right now, though of course some local governments are simply ignoring it, is they're not supposed to be able to take monuments down and move them away to a place that's not of equal prominence. That's actually illegal. But as we've seen, nobody's going to really enforce that law anymore. And so local governments are taking down monuments, Confederate memorials and so forth, and putting up, what I think they should be focused on, those putting up new ones. So local governments can initiate it, and also universities. So one of the things that frustrated me about the Silent Sam dispute, I mean, it wasn't new. I happened to be serving on the UNC Chapel Hill Board of Visitors at the time, and we had multiple reports, multiple meetings about the plans for Silent Sam to put up plaques and other information to contextualize the statue. And the belief was there were people saying, leave it alone, and people saying, tear it down. And that UNC could be sort of a leader in saying, we're not going to tear it down, but we are not going to leave it alone. We're going to try to explain what's going on with the statue and why it brings up such passions. The problem is they just kept sending us reports and it never got done. And by the time they were ready to do it, it was too late because somebody had torn it down. So the universities, I think, should be thinking about, and some of them are, erecting monuments, public art, or even renaming buildings, which I'm not against renaming a building. There are some people that we have across the UNC campuses. We have a few buildings that are named after some pretty problematic people who you could hardly say had enough on the positive to outweigh the negative. And I'm fine, again, if it's done legally, properly, I'm fine with renaming those to honor people that we might want to celebrate as more unifying figures today. But the university is going to have to get on with it instead of taking years. This took years for UNC to develop a plan. Obviously, that was too slow and it came too late. And the state has dragged its feet on these monuments in the state capitol. I say get on with it. Let the local authorities do it. Let the state do it with regard to state property. Remember that the town of Chapel Hill couldn't have told UNC to take down the statue anyway because it's on state property. So there are plenty of public authorities that can act. And by the way, we don't have to wait for that either. We have lots of private institutions that have space for a painting, a mural, a statue. We have shopping centers. We have public squares that are privately owned, essentially. And I think those private actors could act even more quickly and get a lot of positive community support for it.
Well, we've had a little bit of that in Hickory, to be honest. We've had some public art projects that I think people are pretty excited about. In the interest of time, let's just hit one last question, which is about how either a particular politician or people in general maybe could help to reduce the polarization that's evident in our state or our local communities even. What is something we could do if we don't like the polarization? What can we do about it?
Polarization is a challenging question. I've been working on it for a number of years. One of the projects that I started with some other folks was called the North Carolina Leadership Forum. It's based at Duke. We bring together leaders from across the political spectrum and across disciplines. We bring them together, we talk about a complex issue, and we just build rapport. We build social capital among very conservative and very progressive people and all sorts of people in between. Because we have found, I think the evidence would suggest two things. Number one, it is difficult to demonize someone you know, you personally know. I mean, y'all know this because you're in Rotary. The people that you know in your social group, you spend time with, that you do service projects with, you might not agree with them all the time. You may even have significant disagreement, but it's hard to call them really, seriously, I mean, hard to call them names, hard to sort of treat them as the other with a capital O. So one of the ways that we're trying to get leaders to fix this problem is just get to know each other better in a more constructive environment. And then leaders can in turn be leaders. People can emulate leaders acting responsibly rather than leaders accentuating the polarization. But that's a program aimed at leaders. So the question is, what do the rest of us do? And the answer is similar. If you don't already have a good friend who's going to vote differently in the presidential election, go make one. If you don't already have someone in your life who will challenge your view, you read that, but why do you take everything the Wall Street Journal says or the New York Times says seriously? There's other sources of information. I know you saw that on Tucker Carlson, but have you ever tried watching Rachel Maddow? Now, frankly, I don't watch either one. I'm just giving you an example of we have to be willing to, in our own lives, have some messiness and be open to different points of view. One of the most dangerous things we all do, and the internet allows us to do this, is to retreat into little cocoons. You can wake up in the morning and listen to whatever radio show reinforces your pre-existing views as you drive to work, or, back when we used to all drive to work. And then you could spend all day long in between doing work tasks. You could get an email from your favorite political group or magazine or newspaper that tells you that you're brilliant and that you already thought is clearly true. And then on the way home, you can listen to more radio that reinforces it. When you get home, you can watch the cable channel that reinforces it. And because of all of that, I simply think we don't encounter enough ideas that are different from ours and take them seriously as we used to when there were 3 networks. Everybody read the local paper. And so they saw a lot of different points of view. So I think that's part of the story, is just in our own lives, diversifying our news diet and making sure that our friends, our actual friends that we personally know, don't all look and think the same. I think it's helpful to just sort of do an affirmative action of friendship and decide, I don't understand this particular group or this particular view or this particular institution. I'm going to make a friend that will help me understand that.
All right, I think that's good. And Lou, in the interest of time, I think we will yield the floor back to you. Okay,
well, John, thank you very much. You make some fascinating and interesting points. It certainly is sad sometimes to recognize that our history, while it has a lot of good, it has some not so good, and it has some that's pretty bad.
Yep.
And rather than focus on trying to change that, I think John is exactly correct in that we should be focusing on what can we do to improve things in the future. And I hope that that's the way all of us will look at this around the horn. Again, David, thank you for putting this together. You guys make a pretty good team. You do look an awful lot alike. Of course, I'm sure you've heard that many, many times. But John, we do thank you for that program. And David, thank you for putting it together. For our next meeting, our invocation will be given by Bill Carslake. And the program for next meeting will be entitled View from the Towers, A Survivor's Story. I'm sure that'll be very interesting, and I don't think any of you would want to miss that. In the meantime, we will close the meeting with the 4-way test. Is it fair to all concerned? Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it bring goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And thank all of you for joining us. And we will look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.
Have a good week, folks.
Just a quick comment, if I may. Jeff Mackey's wife, Florence, was scheduled for back surgery today, so please keep her in your prayers.
Okay, John, thank you for sharing that with us.
It was yesterday.
Oh, yesterday.
And it was yesterday, and everything went real good.
Okay, thank you. I thought it was this morning. Thank you. Yeah.
I believe the day is John Link's birthday. So happy birthday, John.
No, next month.
Is it John Link?
Lee.